Education for girls in the medieval period wasn't about personal growth, it wasn't about career opportunities. It was about preparation. A girl's education was a direct reflection of the life she was expected to lead. And that life was almost always determined by the family she was born into. There was no single system. A princess learned different things than a merchant's daughter. A merchant's daughter learned different things than a peasant girl. The question wasn't what should a girl learn, it was what does this specific girl need to know to fulfill her future role? At the heart of it all was the church. Religion shaped everything. It provided the moral framework for society. And it had very specific ideas about women. These ideas were complicated. On one hand, there was Eve. She was the temptress from the Garden of Eden, the source of original sin. She was seen as weak, irrational, and a danger to men's souls. This view suggested that women needed to be controlled. They needed to be kept away from dangerous knowledge. Too much learning could lead to pride and disobedience. But on the other hand, there was the Virgin Mary. She was the mother of God. She was the model of the perfect woman, pious, obedient, and silent. She was chaste and humble. Mary offered a path to redemption. A girl should strive to be like Mary, not Eve. So, a girl's education, no matter her social class, always had a strong moral and religious component. The goal was to cultivate virtue. The most important virtues were piety, chastity, and obedience. She was taught to obey her father, then her husband. Her spiritual well-being was paramount. This meant that for most girls, education was not about reading ancient philosophy or debating ideas. It was about learning prayers, it was about understanding her place in a God-ordained world. She learned the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Creed in Latin, even if she didn't understand the words. The sounds and rhythms were part of the ritual of faith. She learned the stories of the saints. These stories were her moral textbooks. They showed her examples of good women who were rewarded for their faith and suffering. So, the foundation of female education was practical and spiritual. It aimed to create a good wife, a good mother, and a good Christian. It was not designed to create an independent thinker. The world was seen as a fixed and ordered place. Everyone had a role to play. A girl's education was the training manual for her specific role. It gave her the skills to manage a household, to raise children in the faith, and to be a source of stability, not disruption. For the vast majority, this meant literacy was unnecessary. You didn't need to read to know your prayers or run a home. You learn by watching, by doing, and by listening. This fundamental purpose of preparation for a predetermined life is the key to understanding everything else about a medieval girl's education. It explains what was taught, who was taught, and why so many were taught nothing at all. For a girl born into the nobility, her world was the castle or the manor house. Her education was designed to make her the mistress of that world. She was a valuable asset to her family. Her marriage could forge an alliance, end a war, or secure vast amounts of land and wealth. So her training began early. She had to become a woman worthy of such a high-stakes union. Her classroom was her home, her teachers were her mother, her governesses, and tutors hired for specific skills. Literacy was a possibility for a noble girl, but it wasn't a given. And what literacy meant was different than it is today. She was more likely to be taught to read than to write. Reading was a passive, private activity. It was useful for personal devotion. A noble woman would have a psalter, a book of psalms, often beautifully illustrated. She would read from it daily. She might also read romances, popular tales of chivalry and courtly love. These stories were entertaining, but they also served as a kind of social instruction. They taught her about the codes of conduct, the manners, and the expectations of aristocratic life. Writing was seen as a more active public skill. It was a tool for business and administration, the domain of men. It was often thought unnecessary or even inappropriate for a high-born lady. There were exceptions, of course. Some highly intelligent women learned to write, managing family correspondence, or even composing their own works. But for most, reading was enough. More important than books were the practical skills of running a great household. A castle was not just a home, it was a large, complex organization. It had dozens, sometimes hundreds of staff. The lady of the castle, the chatelaine, was the chief operating officer. Her education prepared her for this. She had to learn basic accounting to manage the household budget. She needed to know about supplies, how much food to store for the winter, how much cloth was needed for new livery for the servants, how much wine to order. She oversaw the kitchens, the laundry, the stables. She had to be a skilled manager of people, settling disputes among servants and ensuring everyone did their job. She also had to be the household's doctor. With trained physicians rare and expensive, the lady was responsible for the health of her family and her staff. She learned herbalism. She knew which plants to grow in the garden for remedies. She could make poultices for wounds, salves for burns, and teas for fevers. This was a significant and respected body of knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter. And then there were the accomplishments, the skills that displayed her refined upbringing. She learned to sing and play a musical instrument, like the lute or the harp. This was for entertaining her family and guests. She learned to dance, which was a crucial part of court life. She learned needlework and embroidery. This was not just a hobby. Creating elaborate tapestries and vestments was a highly valued art form. It demonstrated her patience, her artistic skill, and her piety, as many works were for the church. A noble girl was also expected to be fluent in French, the international language of the aristocracy in much of Europe. She might also learn some Latin for her prayers. Her education was a mix of the practical and the ornamental. It was intensely focused on her future role. She was being groomed to be a manager, a hostess, a status symbol, and the keeper of her family's health and home. She was not being educated to have a mind of her own, but to be the perfect wife for a powerful man. Her learning was a tool for the advancement of her lineage. For some girls, the path of marriage and household management was not the one they would take. They might be a second or third daughter whose family couldn't afford another dowry. They might be deeply religious, or they might simply be a girl whose family saw another strategic option. For these girls, there was the convent, and inside the walls of the convent, a girl could receive the most academic education available to a woman in the Middle Ages. The convent was not just a place of prayer, it was a self-sufficient community, and in many cases, it was a center of learning. Unlike the education of a noble girl at home, which was often informal, the convent offered a structured curriculum. The goal was different too. A nun's life revolved around the divine office, the 8 daily services of prayer and worship. Participating fully in this life required literacy. It required an understanding of Latin. A girl entering a convent, often as a young child called an oblat, would join the convent school, or schola. Here, she would learn to read and write. The primary text was the Psalter, the Book of Psalms. She would spend years learning its 150 psalms by heart in Latin. This was the foundation of her education. From there, she would move on to other religious texts, the Gospels, the lives of the saints, the writings of the church fathers like St. Augustine and St. Jerome. This was a serious, text-based education. Nuns learned grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the basic building blocks of classical learning. They studied music not as a courtly accomplishment, but to learn the intricate plain-song chants used in the liturgy. A convent had a library, the armarium, and a nun, the armarian, was in charge of it. Nuns would copy manuscripts, a painstaking process to help preserve knowledge. They were not just consumers of books, they were producers of them. Life in the convent offered women opportunities for intellectual leadership that were unimaginable in the outside world. An intelligent and capable nun could rise to become an abbess. An abbess was a powerful figure. She managed the convent's lands, its finances, and its community. She was a spiritual leader and a business administrator. She corresponded with bishops, nobles, and even kings. To do this, she had to be highly educated and politically astute. Some nuns became famous scholars and writers. Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess in the 12th century, is a prime example. She wrote major works of theology, natural history, and medicine. She composed music that is still performed today. She corresponded with the most powerful people in Europe, offering them advice and admonishment. Her intellectual life was vast and influential. Her education in the convent made it all possible. Of course, the quality of education varied from one convent to another. Some were renowned centers of learning, while others were more modest. And it wasn't an option for everyone. A family had to provide a dowry for a girl to enter a convent, just as they did for a marriage. So this path was generally reserved for girls from the upper and middle classes. But for those who did enter, the convent offered a unique space. It was a world governed by women, for women. It was a place where a girl's intellect could be cultivated, not just her domestic skills. It was the closest a medieval woman could get to a life of the mind. Here, learning was not just preparation for marriage, it was a path to God. Life in the growing towns and cities was different. It was a world of commerce, of skilled crafts, and of money. For a girl, born into the family of a merchant or an artisan, her education was shaped by the needs of the family business. It was intensely practical. Her future was not in a castle or a convent, but in a workshop or a shopfront. Her learning was her apprenticeship for that life. Formal schooling was rare for these girls. Some towns had small, private schools that taught basic literacy and numeracy, and a few girls might attend alongside the boys. But for most, the family home and workshop were the only school they ever knew. From a young age, a daughter was her parents' assistant. The type of education she received depended entirely on her family's trade. If her father was a baker, she learned about yeast and flour. She learned how to manage the heat of the oven. She learned how to serve customers and handle money. If her father was a tailor, she learned to sew. She started with simple seams and gradually moved to more complex garments. She learned the different types of cloth, their costs, and their uses. A weaver's daughter learned to card wool, spin thread, and work the loom. A candlemaker's daughter learned about tallow and beeswax. This was not casual learning, it was a formal, though unwritten, curriculum for a specific trade. Literacy was a practical tool, not a cultural accomplishment. A girl in a merchant family might learn to read, write, and do arithmetic. This was because the family business required it. She needed to be able to read a contract, write a letter to a supplier, and keep the account books. In many families, the wife was a business partner. If her husband traveled for trade, she would run the shop in his absence. She had to be competent and literate to do so. Women in towns often had more economic responsibility and independence than their counterparts in the aristocracy. Their education directly reflected this. Guilds, which were associations of craftsmen and merchants, played a role in this system. While guilds were dominated by men, they recognized the importance of wives and daughters in the family enterprise. A master craftsman's widow was often allowed to continue running his workshop after his death, a right that depended on her having the necessary skills. She would have learned these skills over many years working alongside her husband. This was her education. So, a town girl's learning was vocational. It was about gaining the skills to contribute to the family's income and to one day run a household that was also a place of business. There was less emphasis on the refined manners of the court. There was little time for learning the lute or embroidery. Her hands were busy with the tools of her trade. Her mind was occupied with prices, inventory, and customers. This education was less visible in the historical record than that of noblewomen or nuns. It didn't produce books or famous scholars, but it was essential. It was the transfer of economic knowledge from one generation to the next. It empowered women to be active participants in the urban economy. For a girl in this world, her value was not just in her marriage prospects, but in her skills and her ability to work. Her education was her contribution to the family's survival and prosperity. It was concrete, useful, and tied directly to the bustling life of the medieval town. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages did not live in castles or towns. They lived on the land, they were peasants, serfs, farmers. For a girl born into this world, the concept of education as we know it, reading, writing, books, was completely foreign. Her life was one of labor. Her education was about survival. It was a deep practical knowledge passed down from mother to daughter without a single written word. Her classroom was the field, the forest, and the small dark hut she called home. Her curriculum was the cycle of the seasons. In the spring, she learned to help with the planting. She learned which seeds to sow and how to tend the new shoots in the kitchen garden. In the summer, she worked alongside her family in the fields, weeding and tending the crops. She learned to forage in the woods for berries, nuts, and mushrooms, and she learned which ones were safe to eat and which were poison. In the autumn, during the harvest, everyone worked from dawn until dusk. A girl learned to bind sheaves of grain and to glean the fields for any stalks that were missed. This was crucial for the family's survival through the winter. After the harvest, she learned how to preserve food. She helped salt meat, dry vegetables, and pickle what she could. There were no shops to go to. What the family grew or gathered had to last until the next year. Winter was a time for indoor work. A peasant girl's education in the winter months centered on one essential skill: making cloth. She learned to card wool, cleaning and aligning the fibers. Then she learned to spin it into thread using a simple drop spindle. This was a task that occupied countless hours of a woman's life. The thread she spun would be woven into rough cloth to make clothes for her family. She learned basic sewing and how to mend torn garments until they were threadbare. Beyond these agricultural and domestic skills, she learned about childcare. She was often responsible for her younger siblings from a very young age. She learned how to feed them, keep them safe, and soothe them. She learned the folk remedies for common childhood illnesses, knowledge passed down through generations. Her cultural education came from oral tradition. She didn't read stories, she heard them. She learned the songs, the folk tales, and the superstitions of her village. She learned the rhythms of the church year, the feast days, and the fast days through observation and participation, not from a book. Her prayers were memorized, from hearing them repeated over and over. This was a rich world of knowledge, but it was entirely spoken, sung, and demonstrated. So, for A peasant girl, there was no choice. Her path was set. She would work for her family until she married a boy from her own village or a nearby one. Then she would start her own family and continue the same cycle of labor. Her education was perfectly suited for this life. It gave her the skills she needed to feed her family, clothe them, and care for them. It taught her how to survive in a harsh world. It was an education in resilience and hard work, and in the practical wisdom of the land. It had nothing to do with literacy, but it was everything she needed to know. A girl's education in the medieval world was a mirror of her society. It was a system built not on equality or opportunity, but on a rigid sense of place. What a girl learned was defined by who she was and who she was destined to become.